Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Tuesday, February 17th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 57.8 degrees, with a low of 46.8, so layer up for a crisp winter day and enjoy the mild sunshine. Coming up, we'll examine the high stakes involved in efforts to reform FEMA and improve disaster response. We'll also cover the reasons behind the strike by 34,000 Kaiser healthcare workers demanding fairer wages, more staffing, and safeguards against AI overreach in their jobs. Plus, other key stories on global tensions, local innovations, and more. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. This morning, FEMA is at the center of a tug-of-war over what disaster help in America should even look like. Reporter Ethan Shaw is with us to break down the competing plans and what they mean on the ground. Ethan, what's really at stake here?
What's at stake is whether FEMA gets cut down and constrained or elevated and streamlined. On one side, according to NPR and internal documents, the Trump administration is using a FEMA review council to design the biggest executive branch overhaul of the agency in a generation, a plan that would, in the draft's own words, quote, eliminate FEMA as we know it today, end quote. On the other, a rare bipartisan coalition in Congress is pushing the Fixing Emergency Management for Americans Act of 2025, a House bill that would actually beef up FEMA's independence and make it easier for survivors to get help.
Let's start with that review council. What is it? Who created it? And how did it come together?
President Trump created the FEMA Review Council by executive order early last year, often cited as Executive Order 14180, and placed it under the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees FEMA. NPR and member stations like WUNC report it's a small, politically appointed group, roughly a dozen members now, with the charter allowing up to 20, and several of them linked to the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 agenda and Republican Party leadership. The council produced an 89-page draft report in December 2025, which NPR obtained and published today, February 17, 2026. After its final public meeting was abruptly canceled, DHS started calling the work an, quote, iterative process, end quote, and now says a much shorter final report is due late next month.
And what exactly does that draft report try to do to FEMA structurally?
According to NPR's Lauren Sommer and Rebecca Hersher, the draft rests on three big moves. First, cut FEMA's workforce by around half, eliminating more than 12,000 positions, especially the disaster workers who actually deploy into communities. Second, raise the bar for getting a federal disaster declarations. So many more events are left to states and towns. And third, replace a lot of traditional damage-based aid with automatic, so-called parametric triggers tied to things like wind speed or river levels.
Let's take those one at a time. Staff cuts of that size sound huge. How deep are they? And why do experts say they matter?
The draft calls for roughly a 50% reduction in FEMA's total staff, with the majority of those cuts coming from the disaster workforce, the on-call and deployed employees who process claims and show up after hurricanes, fires, or floods. The irony, as GAO audits and NPR's reporting make clear, is that FEMA has already shrunk a lot. The agency has shed roughly 2,000 employees since Trump took office, and GAO found its active workforce dropped nearly 10% just in the first half of 2025. During Hurricane Helene in 2024, FEMA fielded more than 500,000 calls in a single week, yet GAO noted that only between 4 and 12% of FEMA's incident management staff was available to deploy during that broader disaster season. Former FEMA Deputy Administrator Tim Manning told NPR that cutting staff in half when the agency already has a backlog of around 500,000 disaster assistance applications would simply mean slower checks, slower housing help, and longer waits for basics like food and clothing.
The administration keeps talking about efficiency and duplication. Do the independent watchdogs, like GAO, see FEMA as bloated or something else?
GAO's picture is almost the opposite of bloat. In 2025, the Government Accountability Office put, quote, improving the delivery of federal disaster assistance, end quote, on its high-risk list, citing chronic understaffing, rising disaster costs, and serious operational backlogs. According to GAO and summaries in outlets like WUSF, FEMA's senior leadership ranks, the Senior Executive Service, were only about half full by mid-2025 after a wave of early retirements and departures, and the agency was leaning heavily on short-term, undertrained surge hires. So when independent auditors and groups like the Urban Institute look at FEMA, they see an overworked, under-resourced system trying to keep pace with climate-driven disasters, not some cushy bureaucracy ripe for massive cuts.
If you're a mayor or a county emergency manager listening right now, what would losing that many FEMA staffers mean for you?
Local and state officials tell NPR it would mean being on your own far more often, or waiting far longer when you do get help. Josh Morton, who runs emergency management in Saluda County, South Carolina, said it is far more cost-effective to maintain one strong federal team than to force 50 states to build parallel systems for everything from debris removal to individual family assistance. Without that federal backbone, states would be pushed to hire their own large disaster workforces and create grant programs they simply cannot afford, especially smaller or rural states with thin tax bases. And because FEMA already leans on ad hoc staff pulled from other federal agencies, who are less experienced in logistics, cutting the core team just means more confusion and slower response on the ground.
The second big change you mentioned is raising the bar for disaster declarations. How would that work, and how many past disasters would have been turned down?
Right now, under the Stafford Act, governors ask the president for a declaration, and FEMA advises using a per capita damage indicator, basically total damage divided by state population, to judge whether an event overwhelms local capacity. The Review Council wants to raise that per-person threshold significantly and, in its own words, quote, end the federalization of routine disasters, end quote, so fewer events qualify for federal aid. NPR reports that the council ran a look back from 2012 through 2025 and found that, under its tougher formula, about 29% of disasters that actually did receive federal declarations would not have qualified, cutting federal spending by about $1.5 billion over that period. Analyses cited by policy shops, including a 2025 Urban Institute study, warn that if the thresholds were tightened even more along lines suggested in Heritage's Project 2025, well over half of past floods, storms, and wildfires might have been left entirely to state and local budgets.
Who ends up feeling that change first, practically speaking, when you talk to states?
Places that deal with lots of medium-sized disasters, events that do not make national headlines but are devastating locally, get hit hardest. Josh Morton told NPR that in South Carolina, the amount of damage the state would be expected to absorb on its own before FEMA kicks in could jump from around $10 million to roughly $40 million, a fourfold increase. Lynn Budd, who oversees Homeland Security in Wyoming, said local governments simply do not maintain that kind of cash reserve and argued any change would have to be phased in slowly if it happens at all. And remember, FEMA often covers about 75% of the cost to fix roads, schools, and water systems. Without that, communities either postpone repairs or raid other parts of their budgets.
Some conservatives and libertarian groups actually like the idea of higher thresholds. What's their argument for pulling Washington back?
According to NPR and think tank statements, folks like Dominic Lett at the Libertarian Cato Institute argue that higher thresholds would curb what they see as moral hazard, discouraging states from relying on federal bailouts and pushing them to invest more in their own resilience. Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 documents, which have been dissected by outlets like CEPR, say DHS, quote, should not be in the business of handing out federal tax dollars, end quote, and call explicitly for tightening disaster declaration criteria. But even many Republican state officials, especially from disaster-prone areas, worry that flipping nearly a third of past federal disasters back onto state ledgers overnight is simply too steep and too fast. They are open to some recalibration, yet fear the current plan could blow holes in state budgets and leave poorer communities stranded.
The third pillar is this move toward parametric triggers for aid, which sounds pretty technical. How are those supposed to work?
For decades, FEMA has mostly used an indemnity model, where the agency looks at actual, documented damage and then pays up to certain limits. The Review Council draft, as described by NPR and the Bipartisan Policy Center, wants to import ideas from catastrophe bonds and reinsurance by using preset physical triggers instead. So if a Category 3 or stronger hurricane makes landfall in a designated zone, or a river hits a particular flood stage for a set period, or rainfall exceeds, say, 18 inches in 2 days, that could automatically unlock a predetermined federal payout. The attraction is speed and lower overhead. In theory, you do not need to send as many inspectors if the trigger itself releases the money.
And on the flip side, what are emergency managers and equity experts worried about with that model?
One big concern is what insurance people call basis risk, the gap between what the trigger measures and what people actually lose. Jim Reddick, an emergency manager quoted by NPR, pointed out that 10 inches of rain or 100-degree heat can be barely a nuisance in a wealthy city with strong infrastructure, but absolutely devastating in a rural, low-income county with weak levees or no air conditioning. Michael Mendez, a UC Irvine professor and former member of FEMA's National Advisory Council, told NPR these blunt triggers could, quote, bake in, end quote, existing inequities because poor and rural communities not only have weaker defenses, they also often lack dense networks of weather and river gauges. If the nearest official sensor under-records what happened, or if a slow-burn crisis like a heat wave or toxic spill never hits a national trigger, those communities can suffer major harm without any automatic path to federal aid.
All of this is playing out at the same time as that massive sewage spill into the Potomac River. Walk us through what happened there and why it matters in this debate.
In January of this year, a roughly 60-year-old pipe in the Potomac Interceptor, a major regional sewage line, burst near Cabin John, Maryland. Yahoo News reports that about 243 million gallons of wastewater flowed into the Potomac, making it one of the worst sewage spills in modern U.S. history. Maryland Governor Wes Moore and his team argue the pipe is tied to regional and federal responsibilities, including D.C. Water and Environmental Protection Agency oversight. And they say state officials were on scene within hours, while some federal agencies refused to testify at a legislative hearing. Crews have rigged a temporary bypass, but permanent repairs could take up to 9 months, so this is a long-term ecological and public health problem, not a one-day event.
How did President Trump react to that spill, and what did he say FEMA would do?
On his social media platform, Yahoo News notes that Trump called it a, quote, massive ecological disaster, end quote, and blamed, quote, gross mismanagement, end quote, by, quote, local Democrat leaders, particularly Governor Wes Moore, end quote. He also mocked Moore for delays in rebuilding Baltimore's Francis Scott Key Bridge, which collapsed after a ship strike in 2024, calling him a governor, quote, who cannot rebuild a bridge, end quote. At the same time, Trump promised FEMA would take a, quote, key role, end quote, in responding because, in his words, local authorities cannot adequately handle the calamity. That promise comes after he excluded Moore from a recent White House gathering of governors and previously threatened to withhold federal bridge money from Maryland over other political disputes, which the Washington Post has covered as part of a broader pattern.
If the Review Council's overhaul actually takes effect, what would a future sewage disaster like this look like under that new FEMA?
It would likely be much harder for FEMA to step in robustly, even if the president wanted a big show of federal action. A sewage spill's main damage is ecological and long-term health risk, which does not always show up as big per capita property losses, so under higher thresholds the event might not score high enough to qualify for a disaster declaration in a less prominent community. The parametric framework the council sketches is really built around storms, floods, and earthquakes. A pipe failure dumping wastewater has no obvious wind speed or Richter scale number, so unless regulators invent a sewage-specific trigger, it falls through the cracks. On top of that, if FEMA's disaster workforce is cut by half, coordinating among EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, state environmental agencies, and local utilities becomes tougher, especially during what Yahoo News and Politico Pro describe as a partial DHS shutdown, where FEMA is already leaning on limited disaster relief fund balances just to keep core operations going.
We've talked a lot about the administration's plan to shrink and narrow FEMA. Congress is moving almost the opposite direction with the FEMA Act of 2025. What would that bill actually do?
The Fixing Emergency Management for Americans Act, House Resolution 4669, is the main vehicle, and House.gov shows it passed the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee on a lopsided 57-3 bipartisan vote. Sponsored by Republican Sam Graves of Missouri and Democrat Rick Larsen of Washington, it would pull FEMA out of DHS and restore it as a largely independent cabinet-level agency, with the administrator reporting directly to the president. Lawmakers in both parties argue, in statements summarized by Politico Pro, that disaster management gets overshadowed when it sits inside a department preoccupied with border security and immigration. So their starting point is to give FEMA its own seat at the cabinet table and clearer budget authority when crises hit.
Beyond that independence, how would the House plan change the way money flows to towns and to individual survivors?
One of the biggest shifts is for public infrastructure. Instead of the current slow cost reimbursement model, the bill would move toward upfront estimate-based grants under a new Section 409 authority, so engineers agree on a project cost early, FEMA signs off within a set timeline, and then money comes in one lump sum. Disaster law firms like Baker Donelson say that could dramatically cut the years of paperwork and disputes cities now face rebuilding roads, water plants, and electric co-ops. For survivors, housing advocates at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition highlight provisions for a single, simplified application that works across FEMA, the Small Business Administration, HUD, and USDA, so people do not have to re-enter the same information 4 times, and it explicitly makes it easier for folks without fixed addresses to qualify for housing help. The bill also relaxes so-called duplication of benefits rules, so a modest GoFundMe or an SBA loan does not automatically reduce your FEMA grant dollar for dollar, and it tweaks cost sharing so the federal contribution can rise to 85% for communities that adopt strong building codes and invest in mitigation, or fall to 65% for those that refuse.
You mentioned equity in politics earlier. How do these two visions, the review councils and Congresses, handle who gets help and whether partisan favoritism creeps into the process?
The House package leans hard into transparency and equity. NPR and the Washington Post report that it would require FEMA to give extra consideration to poor and rural communities when deciding how to allocate certain funds, and it would create a public dashboard so anyone can see where disaster dollars are going. It also bars political discrimination in awarding aid, which is a direct response to fears that presidents might reward allies and punish opponents, and it mandates a continuing GAO review of FEMA's rules. A related bipartisan bill, the FEMA Operations Continuity Act, aims to keep FEMA's core disaster work running during government shutdowns, which is highly relevant with DHS partially shuttered right now. By contrast, the Review Council approach centralizes more discretion in the executive branch, automates some decisions through blunt triggers, and shifts much of the cost burden to states. A combination GAO and the Urban Institute warn will land hardest on smaller, poorer, and often more marginalized communities.
So as of today, mid-February 2026, where does this fight over FEMA stand, and what should people be watching for in the next few months?
NPR says the FEMA Review Council is rewriting its draft into a leaner final report expected late next month, and because it was created by executive order, DHS could start implementing parts of it through regulation and internal policy without new laws. On the legislative side, the FEMA Act of 2025 has strong bipartisan momentum in the House, but still needs action in the Senate, where timelines are less clear. Layered on top of that is the Potomac sewage spill, and whatever FEMA ultimately does there, which will act as a real-time stress test of the agency's capacity during a partial shutdown, and amid talk of massive cuts. Over the next year, the country is effectively choosing whether FEMA remains a central pillar of our national safety net in an age of climate-driven disasters, or becomes a much smaller, more limited backstop that many communities cannot count on.
A huge decision with very real consequences for anyone who might someday need help after a storm, a fire, or even a sewage spill. Ethan, thanks for breaking it all down for us this morning.
Thanks, Grace.
Our next story is the massive Kaiser Permanente strike that is still not resolved. Reporter Chloe Bennett has been following it closely. Chloe, who is actually out on these picket lines?
According to CalMatters reporter Kristen Huang, in pieces republished by LAist and the Times of San Diego, more than 31,000 Kaiser Permanente health workers in California and Hawaii have been on an open-ended strike since late January. They are represented by the United Nurses Associations of California/Union of Healthcare Professionals, or UNAC/UHCP, and include registered nurses, physical therapists, midwives, nurse anesthetists, physician assistants, and other licensed clinicians. It is the first time in that union's more than 50-year history that they have walked off the job. KPBS and San Jose Inside add that about 3,000 pharmacy and lab workers, represented by the United Food and Commercial Workers, joined on February 9th, bringing the total closer to 34,000.
That is a huge walkout. How does this fit into Kaiser's recent labor history?
This strike comes on the heels of several big confrontations, which the East Bay Times and outlets like Healthcare Dive have laid out. UNAC/UHCP staged a 5-day warning strike in October of 2025 after a 10-week mental health strike back in 2022 by clinicians represented by the National Union of Healthcare Workers, covered then by NPR and the San Francisco Chronicle. In October of 2023, about 75,000 Kaiser workers in the coalition of Kaiser Permanente unions held a 3-day strike that CNN, ABC, and CBS News described as historic, ending in a national deal. Then Southern California mental health workers were out for a record 196 days, from 2024 into May of 2025, so this is really the latest and largest chapter in a long, bitter run.
Let's dig into the money. What is the basic gap between what the union wants and what Kaiser is offering?
UNAC/UHCP is demanding a 25% wage increase spread over 4 years, CalMatters reports. Their argument is that their last contract was signed in 2021 before inflation spiked, and California consumer prices have jumped roughly 20% since then, while their actual raises only totaled around 10 to 12%. Union economists say that works out to about an 8% loss in real buying power over the life of that deal. So they see 25% now as both catch-up and a reset for the next few years.
And they are also talking a lot about fairness compared to other Kaiser unions, right?
Yes, parity is a big theme. Other major Kaiser unions in the coalition bargained after the inflation spike and won agreements in the low 20s over 4 years that they say were adjusted for the higher cost of living. UNAC/UHCP leaders told LAist they deliberately held off hard bargaining during the worst of COVID to avoid disrupting care, and now feel they were punished for that restraint. Executive Director Joe Gazinski told CalMatters, quote, "What we are asking for is the same deal everybody else got to deal with inflation," end quote.
So what exactly is Kaiser putting on the table, and how are they describing it?
Kaiser says it has offered a 21.5% wage increase over 4 years, which it calls its strongest national offer ever, according to CalMatters and Healthcare Dive. The organization estimates that package would cost about $2 billion over the life of the contract, while the union's 25% proposal would be closer to $3 billion, so roughly an extra $1 billion. Kaiser executives also argue this lines up with the pattern set in that 2023 national agreement with the coalition, and that it keeps UNAC/UHCP members among the highest-paid healthcare workers in the country. They are portraying it as both generous and sustainable.
Are these workers actually underpaid compared with other hospitals? Or are we talking about already high salaries?
Independent wage comparisons from outlets like Health EXEC and Fierce Healthcare suggest Kaiser does often lead the market, especially once you factor in its traditional pension and rich health benefits. In California, registered nurses at Kaiser are generally in the low 150s to high 180s annually, with some Bay Area veterans crossing 190,000, while Stanford Healthcare has reportedly nudged some nurse salaries even higher, and Sutter is roughly comparable in certain markets. Physical therapists, midwives, and physician assistants at Kaiser also tend to be well above national averages, sometimes by 20% or more. Kaiser points out that when you combine its 21.5% across-the-board raises with automatic step increases for seniority, many employees would see total pay rise close to 30% over the contract, but the union responds that high nominal wages do not erase the inflation hole or fix understaffing.
Let's talk about that staffing piece. For people who are not in hospitals every day, what are nurses actually complaining about?
California is one of the few states with legally mandated nurse-to-patient ratios, spelled out in Title 22 regulations, like 1 nurse for 2 patients in intensive care and 1 for 5 on a typical medical surgical floor. Union leaders tell KPBS and San Jose Inside that Kaiser routinely violates those ratios, or technically meets them, only by counting nurses who are not truly at the bedside, like charge nurses who are supposed to supervise. Over the last 2 years, UNAC/UHCP members say they filed nearly 14,000 assignments despite objection forms, documenting shifts they believed were unsafe. Kaiser, in statements to LAist and CalMatters, flatly denies breaking the law and says it has made extensive efforts to recruit and retain staff.
So what, specifically, does the union want written into this new contract on staffing?
They are pushing for language that goes well beyond state law. Union bargaining summaries, echoed in Healthcare Dive, say they want only direct bedside nurses to count toward ratios, explicitly excluding charge nurses, break relief nurses, and administrative staff from the math. They also want ratio rules that are fully enforceable through the grievance and arbitration process, including possible financial penalties at the unit level when staffing falls short. And they want faster, binding fixes. Things like adding staff, capping patient loads, or temporarily closing beds, rather than just more joint committees that talk about problems without immediate consequences.
How does that compare with California law and with the national Kaiser deal the coalition unions signed back in 2023?
State law sets the baseline ratios, and a new law called Senate Bill 596, which took effect on January 1st of this year, dramatically increases state fines for violations to $15,000 for a first offense and $30,000 for each subsequent day. But enforcement by the California Department of Public Health has historically been sporadic. Psychiatric staffing rules are also delayed until at least June 1st, which creates gaps on behavioral health units. The 2023 Coalition Agreement, as analyzed by Modern Healthcare and Healthcare Dive, focused on pledges to hire 10,000 additional workers and strengthen joint staffing committees and unit-based teams, rather than hard numerical penalties. UNAC/UHCP leaders say those committees have not solved chronic understaffing on the ground, so they now want stricter internal standards and a second enforcement track through their contract, on top of whatever the state does.
One unusual angle here is technology. Why is artificial intelligence, of all things, part of a hospital strike?
Clinicians are increasingly alarmed by what some of them call assembly line medicine, where algorithmic care pathways and auto-generated documentation start to override professional judgment. Union bargaining briefs, highlighted by health tech outlets like Health EXEC, show UNAC/UHCP is seeking very explicit AI guardrails, modeled on language they previously negotiated at Sharp Healthcare in San Diego. They want the contract to say clearly that AI tools are advisory only, and that a nurse's or clinician's judgment is the final word in patient care decisions. They are also demanding protections, so AI cannot generate notes or billing under a clinician's license unless that person actually did or verified the work, plus whistleblower protections and a formal, possibly veto-level voice in deciding which AI systems get deployed and how they are evaluated.
You mentioned some newly unionized professionals, too. What is happening with midwives, nurse anesthetists, and physician assistants in Northern California?
CalMatters reports that certified nurse midwives, certified registered nurse anesthetists, and physician assistants in Northern California recently organized under UNAC/UHCP and are bargaining their first contracts with Kaiser. Union negotiators say Kaiser has proposed cutting retirement and medical benefits compared with what those clinicians currently receive, freezing wages for existing staff at their present levels, and lowering starting pay for new hires. For a first contract, workers usually hope to lock in improvements, not accept rollbacks, so that has become a major flashpoint. It is a big part of why many of these professionals, who had never struck before, are now on the picket lines.
Midwives, in particular, seem central to how Kaiser delivers babies. How much leverage do they really have?
Quite a lot, at least in some hospitals. CalMatters highlights midwife Emily Hardy at Kaiser Redwood City, who says certified nurse midwives deliver about 80% of vaginal births in some Northern California Kaiser facilities, and she cites research showing midwife-led care for low-risk pregnancies cuts cesarean rates, lowers maternal complications, improves patient satisfaction, and costs less than physician-led care. Hardy and her colleagues say they have been negotiating with Kaiser for 2 years and feel the benefit cuts and lack of wage progression signal that the organization does not truly value their central role. Lead midwife negotiator Brian Mason told CalMatters that in pure dollar terms, the two sides are only a few hundreds of thousands of dollars apart, which he likened to being $10 apart for a typical person given Kaiser's multi-billion-dollar finances, reinforcing the sense that this is about precedent and power, not raw affordability.
Let's turn to patients. 4 weeks in, what are Kaiser members actually experiencing on the ground?
Reporting from LAist, the Times of San Diego, KPBS, and the East Bay Times describes a system under real strain. Some surgeries, including procedures patients did not consider elective, have been postponed or canceled. Certain chemotherapy and infusion appointments have been delayed, and specialist visits or imaging are being rescheduled months out. A number of outpatient labs and specialty clinics have reduced hours or temporarily closed. Kaiser emphasizes in statements to CBS News that it spent months preparing by hiring about 7,600 temporary clinicians, reassigning more than 1,000 non-striking employees into direct care, and shifting many visits to telehealth or phone. But even with that, many patients say they feel the disruption acutely.
There was one vivid example at a Downey pharmacy that really captured people's attention. Can you walk us through that?
CalMatters and LAist tell the story of 50-year-old Kaiser member Cecilia Ochoa from Downey, who went back to a Kaiser emergency room recently with nausea and weakness and was diagnosed with a urinary tract infection. When she went to pick up her antibiotics at Kaiser Downey's 24-hour pharmacy, she found a line of about 100 people, snaking almost to the street. She tried another Kaiser pharmacy nearby, waited around an hour, then staff announced they would not fill any more prescriptions that day. One man told reporters he had already waited 3 hours just to check in, while workers handed out snacks and water to people stuck in line. Ochoa said it has gotten harder to see specialists in recent years, with waits of months, but she still backs the strikers, saying of Kaiser's current priorities, quote, "It is not about the patient, it is about the money," end quote.
Money brings us to that $66 billion in reserves that the union keeps talking about. How accurate is that number?
Union leaders do base that on real figures from Kaiser's audited financials and state filings, as outlets like KPBS and Healthcare Dive have reported. They point to what they describe as about $66 to $67 billion in reserves and investments, and to a swing from a $4.5 billion loss in 2022 to roughly $12.9 billion in net income in 2024 and $9.3 billion in 2025. From their perspective, rejecting an extra $1 billion in wage costs over 4 years, around $250 million a year across the whole system, looks more like preserving margins and power than necessity. They also highlight high executive and physician leader compensation to make that case.
And what do Kaiser's own books and regulators say about how much of that money is actually available for paychecks?
Kaiser's 2025 annual results, released on February 6th, Plus, reports from the California Department of Managed Healthcare and rating agencies like S&P and Fitch suggest that headline number is not a giant checking account, as Fierce Healthcare has explained. Much of it is tied up as net assets without donor restrictions, backing long-term pension and retiree health liabilities that total somewhere between roughly $16.8 and $25 billion. And significant chunks are in illiquid investments like hedge funds and private equity that cannot be quickly tapped without losses. As a health plan regulated under the Knox-Keene Act, Kaiser also has to maintain tangible net equity and enough reserves to keep its AA- type credit ratings, which in practice means hundreds of days of cash on hand when you are running more than $100 billion in annual revenue and facing billions in seismic retrofit spending before 2030. Kaiser's chief financial officer, Kathy Lancaster, has noted that their days cash on hand is already below the average for similarly rated systems, and that their core operating margin from patient care last year was only about 1.1%, so they argue using reserves to permanently raise payroll could threaten their rating and eventually drive up premiums.
So you have unions saying, you can clearly afford this, and Kaiser saying, not without jeopardizing the future. How is that standoff playing out legally?
CBS News and KPBS report that Kaiser has filed unfair labor practice charges, accusing UNAC/UHCP of violating established national bargaining procedures, and using this regional strike to push issues they claim belong in national forums. The union, in turn, accuses Kaiser of bad faith bargaining and of failing to seriously address chronic staffing problems and new technology concerns. As of today, February 17th, there is no sign in coverage from CalMatters, LAist, or Healthcare Dive that the National Labor Relations Board has issued any ruling strong enough to change the basic power balance at the table. So both sides are still fighting it out in public opinion and in day-to-day negotiations.
As we sit here this morning, where do things actually stand? And why are so many people outside California watching this so closely?
Pulling together reporting from CalMatters, KPBS, the East Bay Times, and others, roughly 31,000 UNAC/UHCP members, plus several thousand UFCW pharmacy and lab workers, are still out on what is now a fourth-week open-ended strike that began January 26th. Formal talks have restarted after an early stalemate, but both sides admit they remain far apart on wages, enforceable staffing protections, and AI guardrails, while patients in California and Hawaii continue to see long waits, reshuffled care, and pockets of real disruption even as emergency rooms and inpatient units stay open with contingency staff. Nationally, other hospital systems, healthcare unions, regulators, and even technology companies are watching because this is turning into a test case how far big, brand-name nonprofits like Kaiser will go to restore inflation-eroded pay, whether frontline clinicians can win real contractual control over staffing ratios instead of relying mainly on state law and joint committees, and what binding limits will govern AI and automation in clinical work. Until one side's calculation of risk changes or a mediator helps craft a compromise, the strike remains one of the most consequential healthcare labor conflicts in recent United States history, with direct consequences for how millions of people experience care.
A complex, high-stakes standoff with workers, management, and patients all feeling the pressure. Chloe, thanks for walking us through it.
Thanks, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. Reverend Jesse Jackson, a towering pulpit and political presence in the American Civil Rights Choir, has died at the age of 84 on the morning of February 17, 2026, after a decade battling the neurodegenerative illness, later identified as progressive supranuclear palsy. A protege of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a witness to King's 1968 assassination, Jackson spent more than 6 decades preaching justice into policy through his Chicago-based Rainbow Push Coalition. His groundbreaking presidential bids in 1984 and 1988 built the original Rainbow Coalition, registering millions of new voters and opening the ballot box door for future minority candidates. As tributes pour in from around the globe, admirers remember him as a servant leader who pushed corporate America to color outside the old lines on hiring and equity. With his passing, many say an era of civil rights, old guard, has finally taken its bow, leaving big shoes and bigger expectations for the next act. In Texas, a courtroom drama is putting protest and terrorism on the same legal scales. The federal trial has opened in Fort Worth for 9 people accused in the July 4, 2025, shooting at the Prairieland Detention Center. Prosecutors say the defendants were part of a so-called North Texas Antifa cell and orchestrated an ambush that left Alvarado Police Lieutenant Thomas Gross wounded, bringing charges that range from terrorism to attempted murder. Defense attorneys counter that this was a political protest against immigration policy that spiraled, not a pre-planned plot. The case is seen as a landmark test of how the Justice Department labels and prosecutes decentralized political movements, with immigrant advocates and police unions watching closely. A conviction could rewrite the rulebook on what counts as domestic terrorism, with penalties stretching from 10 years to life. In New Delhi, the AI Impact Summit is recoding the global tech narrative as a tale of two strategies: United States ecosystem perfection versus Chinese mass adoption. A new report from the Institute of Strategic Intelligence and Intervention, titled Technologies Shaping the Future, says America still leads in foundational research and commercialization, while China leans on long-term planning, scale, and a vast home market to weave artificial intelligence into infrastructure and public services. The study forecasts a seismic shift of roughly $350 trillion in global wealth by mid-century, but warns of a possible $13 trillion market correction as energy demands spike. Indian officials are pitching applied AI and digital public infrastructure over abstract safety debates, casting India as a bridge power for the global south. Analysts note that China's good enough and open-source approach, showcased by systems like DeepSeek, is spreading faster in emerging markets than the United States' focus on far-frontier AGI, turning an arms race into a standards race over chips, trade, and tech rules. In Bangladesh, history is turning a new page and shelving an old chapter of dynastic rivalry. Tariq Rahman, chair of the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, has been sworn in as prime minister after a landslide victory in the first general election since the 2024 uprising. President Mohammad Shahabuddin administered the oath on the South Plaza of the Jatiya Sangsad Bhavan in Dhaka, drawing the curtain on an 18-month interim government led by Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus. The BNP-led alliance secured a commanding two-thirds majority, winning 212 of the 300 parliamentary seats, while the Jamaat-e-Islami alliance took 77. Rahman becomes the first male prime minister in 35 years, bringing an end to the long-running Battle of the Begums between Sheikh Hasina and Khalida Zia. His government now faces the heavy lift of implementing the July National Charter, more than 80 promised reforms aimed at blocking any return to one-party rule, in a country still polarized, and with the Awami League shut out of the ballot. And in Sudan, a marketplace has become the latest frontline in a war without clear borders. Rights monitors say at least 28 people were killed and dozens wounded when a series of drone strikes hit the crowded Al Safia market in the Sodari area of North Kordofan on February 15th. The Emergency Lawyers Group blames the Sudanese armed forces for targeting shoppers during peak hours, killing women, children, and the elderly, though the army denies any responsibility and insists it does not strike civilian sites. Observers warn the attack marks a chilling escalation in the use of unmanned aircraft along the Kordofan corridor, a vital artery between Rapid Support Forces territory in the west and army-held zones in the east. As both sides battle over roads and revenue, the human toll keeps rising, with more than 12 million people already displaced and what little remained of normal daily life now caught in the crosshairs. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT 5.1, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.